KUNC and the NPR network, this is In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. In 2025, chatbots are part of ordinary life. They pop up on your screen while you're checking your bank account or making an online purchase. But a few years from now, it may be just as easy to have a conversation with a chatbot who recreates a dead loved one. That's the idea behind something called a generative ghost. And a researcher at the University of Colorado is one of the people leading the development of this technology.
Imagine that unfortunately your mother has died and you need to order some flowers for the funeral, but you don't remember what her favorite flower is.
That's Jed Brubaker. He's an associate professor who studies how we interact with generative artificial intelligence.
And one could imagine logging into her Gmail and asking the generative ghost, well, what was my mom's favorite flower? And it, knowing all the email, could respond and say, oh, it was a calla lily.
We wanted to know, what would a visit with the generative ghost of a dead loved one feel like? Would it be moving, nostalgic, upsetting? Jed spoke about his work last winter with In The NoCo's Brad Turner. We're listening back to that conversation today. Jed started by talking about one of the more personal projects he's working on.
I just recently got 12 full boxes of my grandfather's diaries, and I have this little pet project. I want to pull them all into an AI model. We can think about this as an AI chatbot so that I could ask it questions in the same way that we might go to Google and ask questions. I would like to know a little bit more about what my grandfather's life was like when he turned 50, so that when I turn 50, I can compare the two.
This idea of having people return to our lives in digital form might make a lot of people think of an episode of the show Black Mirror. There's sort of an infamous episode where a woman gets a digital clone of her deceased boyfriend, and he's less than ideal. This is a clip from that. The two of them are sleeping next to one another, and she's a little creeped out when he doesn't close his eyes when it's time to sleep.
What is it?
What were you doing?
Nothing.
The way that your eyes were open scared me.
You'd prefer if I closed them?
Well, when you're sleeping, yeah.
I don't really need to sleep.
Well, just try next time.
Jed, how accurate is this unsettling Black Mirror version of having a generative ghost in our life?
This episode certainly comes up a lot. It's actually required viewing in many of the classes I teach because it raises the right kinds of questions. And one might think, oh, that means this whole thing is creepy and AI is bad. I'm left wondering, well, shouldn't it just learn to close its eyes? But I think it's important for us to consider the range of things that might be going on here. We don't look at an upsetting text message and say all text messaging is bad. And it's important to think about all the ways that we memorialize and remember our loved ones. I think a lot of this really depends on how it's presented and how it's framed to the person. Are we setting up the generative ghost as the loved one or an approximation or representation of that loved one?
Yeah, these are fascinating questions because I wonder what it would be like to have a simulated version of a deceased family member say something affectionate to me. I think that could be maybe very moving or maybe sort of inauthentic and unsettling. How much do you think about that in your work?
This is central to what we're thinking about. This is one of the key issues that we've laid out in our research that needs to be considered, and that's the relationship to the person who has died. Something I'm oftentimes telling software engineers is that death is not a switch. It's not a yes or no. The way we grieve someone who we've lost is different on day one versus year 10. And you know, we often are thinking about what would happen if, like, our spouse died and would we want to animate them with AI? But what if we fast forwarded 2 generations and had the ability to think about this more historically? I sometimes think about Disneyland and the Hall of Presidents. I don't remember being really upset when I saw Abraham Lincoln come to life and say fourscore and, because I understood what it was. It really kind of, if we're frank, a really dumb version of AI, and we're coming way further than that. But provided the right context and presented in the right way, these things can be educational, they can be sources of heritage, they also can be fond memorials and ways of remembering our loved ones.
You have this grant you've received from Google to research how generative ghosts might interact with us. What are you most interested in looking at in this research?
I think a really important question is this issue of representation versus reincarnation. So does the generative ghost represent a person, like in my example of Abraham Lincoln, or does it in some way reincarnate them, as if it recreates them? Are we communicating to people who are using these systems that this is a likeness or that it is them? And I think that sets us up for different psychological relationships and consequences of these interactions.
How much do you think about the mental health of the person who'd use this technology and have this experience with a deceased loved one?
So I think about this a lot, and I certainly, my undergrad was in clinical psychology, so this is never far afield for me. You know, people often ask this question about, will this be bad for people's mental health? And there are certainly scenarios in which it could. However, if we look at the history of grief, particularly in an American context, we oftentimes have been overly protective of people. For a long time in the 80s and 90s, therapists would tell people, yeah, you need to get over it, like come to terms with the fact that you've lost a loved one. And that's not really how psychologists do things anymore. They acknowledge that we have continued relationships with our loved ones. We still think about them. We maybe visit the gravesite and we talk to them. We still have a relationship. Just the nature of the relationship has shifted. And that's why we see people return to photo albums, go to Facebook profiles as memorials, and continue to have these bonds with the deceased. The question here is, how do we do AI in a way that follows in that tradition and is healthy without necessarily putting people who are at risk of having a more complicated relationship with their grief at further risk?
Jed, what excites you most about working with generative ghosts?
There are strong opinions about AI in both directions, and all those opinions are merited. For me, I think about this as a new interface, a new tool, a new way of looking. You can think about this as a lens. You know, there is value in looking at photos, and then there's value of looking at journals. There's value in looking at videos. None of those are going to replace the others. If we think about technology as giving us a richer palette of how to express ourselves, how to experience the world around us, I see this as another layer. Where I get excited in my work is that this gives us another layer to think about and connect with the past.
Jed Brubaker is Associate Professor at the University of Colorado Boulder in the Department of Information Science. He spoke with In The NoCo's Brad Turner in November. By the way, we've also interviewed Jed about another project he's excited about at CU Boulder. It's called the Digital Legacy Clinic. Jed and his team provide expert guidance on how to manage a loved one's digital affairs at the end of their life, including email, social media accounts, and transferring important files. We'll include a link to that interview in our show notes and at KUNC.org. If you have thoughts on this episode or any of our episodes, let us know. Drop us a line at noco@kunc.org. That's NOCO@kunc.org. That's it today for In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. Thank you so much for listening.